thanks everyone being here this morning. I want to talk about 3 sets of pieces. The first set of questions has to do with what is the nature of the global capital crisis that we are entering into or we are already in. There's this general understanding that we are entering into a structural prolonged crisis of global capitalism. But the question is, with this crisis, what would be the nature of this crisis? Would it be similar to some of the previous periods of structural crisis, so that after a period of prolonged and painful adjustment, nevertheless, in the end, capitalism will find a way to renew itself, restructure itself, and reappear in another form of capitalism? Or alternatively, would this crisis be different? Would it be the fundamental crisis of capitalism? Would it turn out to be the fatal crisis of capitalism? Or final crisis of capitalism? So that's one set of questions. And secondly, what has been the historical relationship between this geopolitical phenomena known as China and the capitalist world system? How has China been historically interacted with the evolution of the capitalist world system? And in particular, what are the implications of this phenomena of so-called rise of China? Then thirdly, there's the political question about whether we could have any future about any hope about the future. By speaking of we, I'm talking about what would be the future for the great majority of the world, what would be the future for the exploited, oppressed in the world. So do we have any confidence that the current crisis, current struggle, that will result in results that would be favorable for the exploited and oppressed in the world? And on what basis can we say that we are confident that the current struggle will lead to results that will turn out to be favorable for the exploited and oppressed in the world? Okay, so to begin with, if we look at this graph, which basically shows the rate of growth of global economy from the beginning of the 20th century to now, in 10-year moving average, so that you smooth out some short-term fluctuations. So if we look at the first half of 20th century, when the global economy was growing average about 2% a year, so very slow rate by the historical standard, it was of course a time of major crisis of global capitalism. It was a time that included the Great Depression, 2 world wars. That was then followed by the restructuring of global capitalism in the mid-20th century. Okay? And so by the mid-20th century, you observe this dramatic upsurge in the growth rates of global capitalism. It was followed by the so-called golden age in the 1950s and 1960s, when global capitalist economy was growing rapidly, and when global capitalism was even delivering sustained improvements in living standards in much of the capitalist world, but in particular in Western Europe and North America. So that was known as the golden age. But then by the 1970s and 1980s, and you see this second trough in the growth performance. So it was a time when global capitalism was again characterized by economic and political instabilities. Then after that, by the beginning of this century, it seems that the growth performance in global capitalism again improved. You see this mini boom in the early 21st century. But of course, by now, all the indications are that, although it will still take some time for this curve to decisively turn down, because it's in 10-year average, right? Now, again, all the indications are that the neoliberal global capitalist regime has entered into a decisive crisis. So the conditions of accumulation of neoliberal capitalism could no longer be sustained. And basically, both the Western European capitalism and North American capitalism now are suffering from persistent stagnation and probably will run into another major crisis in the near future. So in this context, the question is, what will be the nature of this current structural crisis? And what is the likelihood that capitalism could find ways to renew and restructure itself in the foreseeable future? To ask this question, it may be useful to look at how historically capitalism has addressed its own structural crisis. So for example, back to the mid-20th century, how did capitalism manage to get out of the major structural crisis in the first half of the 20th century and then recreate conditions favorable for global capitalist accumulation? So right after World War II, there was this consolidation of the US hegemonic power. And then US imperialism basically led the restructuring of global capitalism. New institutions were created that contributed to economic and social stability of global capitalism. That included the welfare state institutions that accommodated the historical demands of the Western working classes. There has been some redistribution of income and wealth, especially in the context of Western capitalism that contributed to social compromise. But in particular, in terms of material conditions, global capitalism in the mid-20th century was able to benefit from this what was still quite abundant supply of cheap natural resources, as well as what appeared to be a still quite abundant space for environmental exploitation. Now, by comparison, if we look at our current historical paradigm, first of all, there's this growing consensus. The US hegemonic power is now in decisive decline, but not any other big power, including China, I would say including China, is in the position to replace the United States to serve as the effective hegemonic power to lead the restructuring of global capitalism exactly at the moment of crisis of global capitalism. Moreover, the historical institutions that contributed to the stability of capitalism